Hello, today is December 12th, 2006. We're meeting today with Mr. Walter Hotchkiss at his home in Fort Collins, Colorado. My name is Brad Hoops. I'm the interviewer for the Northern Colorado Veterans Oral History Project. Hello, Mr. Hotchkiss.
Oh,
Thank you for participating in this project today.
oh. I always love to talk about myself. We all do.
Okay. Well, let's start out if we can. If you can tell us a little bit about yourself, when and where you were born.
All right. I'm a Colorado resident. My father was a country doctor in Brighton, south of here, and that's when there was countryside around. And he was a CU graduate from 1914. He was in World War One, and his son was in World War Two.
Had he ever talked to you about his experiences?
No,
with
he didn't a great deal. A couple of times he mentioned some things. I remember I got into his army trunk once, and all this material was here, and I went through. I didn't mean anything by that musette bag, and they called it the officers had. And he was in a base hospital in France. If I ever go back to Europe again, I've been on a number of trips. I like to find out through the War Department where he was, and then I would also go where I was. But yeah, my mother said one thing. She said when he came home, he was never quite the same again. Of course, he wasn't on the front lines or anything, but these people were, let's face it, medicine was pretty primitive at that time.
Sure, yeah.
And if there was a bad leg, they just cut it off, and things, very, very difficult. And there was chloroform and a few things. And he probably saw some gas cases, things like that, so, yeah.
Did you have any siblings?
No. Me?
Yeah.
No. I didn't marry till I was 43. And we lived in Brighton. My dad died in 1937. And so it was just my mother and myself. And then I was in a boys' boarding school just before the war, from 1940 to 43. And that was a wonderful training, not only academically, but we had kerosene lamps. It was up Los Olivos, up above Santa Barbara. And it's a ranch school, and still is, but my mother made some mistakes in rearing me, but that wasn't one of them. And the headmaster was not afraid to paddle you if you needed it, and I don't think that hurt us any.
Yeah.
Maybe my ego, but not my rear end. But anyway, I think one of the things that strikes me about that is we had very simple food. Of course, we occasionally try to sneak in some booze. That's 16, 17-year-olds. But at any rate, I look back on it, and I told somebody once when I first got in service, I thought there's been a drastic mistake. I've been transferred to the Los Angeles Country Club. I mean, the food was better. The evenings off, I didn't have to study. I could go to PX and get a beer, things like that, And then later on, of course, I got used to that and whatever happened until I went overseas. But that was a wonderful thing for me because there were a lot of people at that time who had never really been away from home before. You
Right.
may have had some of the other veterans, and they just cracked up. And hell, I've been away from home for 3 years. I mean, I'd go in the fall until Christmas and come home for Christmas, and then in the spring, my mother might come out, or one of the other students invite me to their home for spring break. It usually be in March, and then I was home in June again for the summer. So that was a nice time, and I still remember Pearl Harbor. I came down that morning, so it was a Sunday morning, and I remember I was talking to some people, and somebody said, "Oh, did you hear? The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor." And I ended up being a geography teacher, but at the time I thought, that must be in Florida somewhere. And I thought, well, how'd they get across Mexico? But at any rate, then I remember Mr. Squibb, he was the headmaster, he'd been in World War I in the artillery, and part of the Squibb pharmaceutical family. But he wanted to have this school. He started in 1932, and he felt we had too many things we didn't really need. It hurt us to, tough it a little bit. But at any rate, I remember he got that evening, and he talked to us in the chapel. We always had a short service before dinner, and he talked about this and pointed to a statue that had been made by one of the former students or friends of his, and he was in Manila at the time, and things like that. But
Well, being over on the West Coast,
there were a lot of things because that spring when I came down to Los Angeles, the Japanese submarine came up and shelled. And you could see right where they had shelled. And I understand later, I think they hit an oil derrick or something, although it didn't explode. And then I understand from reading in previous years since then that some of this material, they had also sent balloons across, and they exploded, you probably know, in the forest, but they kept it completely quiet. There was no talk about that until after the war. And some of them did drift up and even started, I think, on that westerly wind belt.
Yeah.
So, and before I went in service, I was camping. We had pack animals at the time. Went in a place called Lost Park up by Kenosha Pass. And we came out, and that's when we heard the Japanese had invaded the Aleutian Islands. And of course, they put that road in so quick you wouldn't believe it. That just, but that brought it in a little bit closer.
How soon after Pearl Harbor then did you join the
Well,
service?
see, I was just 16, just about to turn 16. When Pearl Harbor, I did following February, so I had 2 years. And I thought I'd just go ahead and go to school, and when the draft comes at 18, they gave me those last few months. I was February 1943, I went in, in June, but actually I was age at February, but they gave me the 3 or 4 months.
So you were drafted as a...
Right,
okay.
I've got a thing here someplace that shows we used to have meetings together on Pearl Harbor from people in Brighton that were in service from World War I and World War II. But here it says Adams County accepted Tuesday for induction. And there's Leonard Stout, I knew, and Walter Kendrick Hotchkiss. I wonder who that is. Robert Franklin Briggs, yeah, and Bob Brimkamp and so forth. And there's a Japanese student here. He was a volunteer. There were some Japanese that had small farms and things around that. Of course, that was all farming then.
Right,
That's how
right.
Dad made his money, because he had contracts with the Kuhner Empson Company, you may have heard of, and so forth. And of course, all those people, all that's gone. They sold out to Libby's or something. So we really were. But I did a lot of things those summers. Did a lot of camping and things, and we also traveled a lot. And even to Europe. It's always, sometimes when I mention this, people think, well, he's just showing off. But there were teachers. I tell, listen, there were teachers on these trips. Number one, it was much cheaper, but you weren't getting the salary either, but you needed the time. We went to Europe in 1938, and it took us 10 days to get over there. Overnight to Chicago, and that was something to take a train to Chicago overnight. Then you had to spend a day in Chicago. It was just one of those things. And you always wanted to get to New York City a day or two early. In 1940, there was the World's Fair and all that. So anyway, then 7 days across the Atlantic. So you're looking at 10 days and 10 days back. So that's 3 weeks. Even today, how many people could take 3 weeks off just to go over there, come back, and not even see anything? But of course, long before the era of the jets or anything like that.
So you were over in 38?
Yeah, I was over in 38. I was
Prior
13
to
at the time.
Really everything breaking, the war truly breaking out.
Well,
in 39.
I remember I was a little young, but I remember docking at Glasgow, Scotland, and there was some cheery man there with his white hair, and he's smiling at me and all. And then when we were in Berlin, why, it was just such a shock, because we don't see it here now. We did during the war, of course. But there were just men in uniforms all over the place. And there were just, you didn't see men in civilian clothes. And it was obvious to a 13-year-old they're preparing for war. And so that was interesting. We saw Hitler's home on a Unter den Linden, the main street, and all this sort of thing. And we traveled around various places, Switzerland and so forth. And then I remember when we went over into Holland, toward the end of the trip, why the customs man comes through and he gives a short Heil Hitler salute. It was very nice, and he went through everything, and anyway, but later when I was listening to the radio, and we'd been held toward the spring of '45 to let the Russians take Berlin, I'd hear this broadcast music and think, I was there one time, and all, and then, of course there was all that street fighting. You just can't imagine what it must have been. But at any rate.
Well, yeah, I'll ask a question later on, the contrast between that trip and your war experience, what you've seen. But
right.
So you entered, then went off to boot camp June of 43?
Yeah, right, June of 43. What they did, they took us into camp in town. What is the one? I think it's all closed up now. I can't think of it right now. It was the induction center there. And I had a skin rash or something, so they kept me there several days to do that, and then they gave us all a bunch of tests. And of course we didn't know where we were going or what. And they said a preference, and I said I was interested in joining the 10th, we didn't know what it was then, the 10th Mountain Division for skiing. But they only took people who already knew how to ski for the most part, and I can understand that, because there weren't, and they didn't want to bother training other people and everything. But at any rate, that was, so we went to California. We got on the train and didn't know where we were going, and eventually we got to Camp Callan, K-C or K-A-L-L-A-N. It was the smallest army post in the United States, only 10,000, and it was anti-aircraft artillery, and then they could shoot their guns and shoot at targets and things over the ocean from the coast. And of course there were all marine things, all sorts of things going on, and I'd seen Los Angeles before, but it was such a boom at the time, and all these servicemen and all that sort of thing there. But I did my basic training there in, what is it, 90 millimeter anti-aircraft guns. And then I was to be a spotter, which means, of course, this is a defensive weapon. That's one reason it didn't last, because we're already going on the offense. We didn't need people anymore. But at any rate, you have to be able to spot a plane and tell them where to fire, or not, don't shoot your own planes down. So they finally got, so you just show you a tail end and you'd know what it was, all the different planes and things like that. And we went on maneuvers, and they sent us to, let's see, that was about December of 43, and in January they sent us to Fort Bliss, El Paso, Texas. And that's one of the old Army places, and I think there's still a fort down there and everything. But at any rate, we went there, and of course that wasn't Southern California by any means. We were out in the desert, but they had this fighter searchlight team idea that the searchlights would blind the pilots, and then the guns could see where to shoot. And we were scattered every few miles around and so forth. And so we trained in that, and then by that was 44. And in the spring of 44, it was pretty obvious they needed a lot more infantry. That's where something like 70 to 80% of the total casualties were having the infantry. And I had a sergeant that was 30, maybe late 30s, and he had been joined the Air Force to be a pilot, or at least a gunner, and they took all those people and they put them in the infantry, and they just needed more manpower. And of course they weren't, some of them weren't too happy about that, but there's not much you could do. So I went to Camp Mccoy, which is in northern Wisconsin, Wisconsin Dells area. And that was nicer. There were more towns around. We could even on a weekend, if you got a weekend pass, you could go to Chicago and things like that. So all these anti-aircraft artillery people were put in the infantry. So we started our training all over again in the infantry. And eventually I ended up in the mortar squad. And
by choice, or
no, they just decided. Of course, that's much better than a rifle company. There's nobody ahead of the rifle companies, and but the mortars can be back a mile and a quarter, something like that. 81 can go up to 2 miles, 2.5 miles, something like that. And so we trained with that, and then of course D-Day came and everything, and then my mother wrote to me, I remember, she says, well, it looks to me like you're not going to go overseas. And it wasn't long after that but see, they were just taking all these pilots and all kinds of things because they needed infantry. So so I was in the 76th Division, and so we trained there until I think just about Thanksgiving. and then they sent us to Boston, Camp Miles Standish. I don't know it's in existence anymore, but from there, and we shipped out. We had a few days there, and then we shipped out, and that was interesting. That of course the submarine menace was pretty well eliminated by then. It wasn't like it had been earlier. And
How was the crossing itself, though?
oh, not bad at all. And of course I'd been on ships
Yeah.
before, but you had to wear your life jacket all the time. Sleep in it, everything. You never knew what was going to happen, and you had your guard posts. I remember somebody came by and the fellow was seasick and he vomited right while I'm standing there, and I should have been nicer about those things. You know, as you get older, you start. I shouldn't have, but I'd shoot him out and said, "You go get something and clean this up." And it wasn't really his fault. But it was 7 days. But I went out one morning, and here was an aircraft carrier, some destroyers and all, and I thought of my father crossing because he told me about going on this ship and all, and I hadn't been on any ships before that. That's before he died, of course, and I hadn't been on ships any time until 1938. But at any rate, we landed in Plymouth, and then from there we went up to Bournemouth, I'd have to look it up. But anyway, it's outside of London, and of course we'd had most of our training and everything by then, and we did get a pass into London, but of course everything was shut down. And
What was the city?
yeah, I mean, I want to take the people to the tower. Of course, I'm thinking, you've been overseas? You know, that was really something. So I'm acting like, well, I'll just take these boys around and show. So we got in the cab, and I said, let's go to the tower. Oh boy, this guy really knows what he. We went there. Of course, it's all closed up. See, during the war, there was, which I could understand. But at any rate,
was there a lot of damage done in the city from the bombing?
Not as much as I thought. I don't think it was really. By that time, they were getting some of those V2s. See, that was November of '44,
Yeah.
and they were getting some of these V1s and V2s. They were exploding. I remember we came out of a movie theater one night, and there was a big fire down someplace. But I don't think England was bombed anything like Germany. Those cities, I didn't see Berlin, but I saw Nuremberg and places like that, and you just couldn't believe it. They just absolutely pulverized it. And but it was interesting to see. You get on a subway, and here were different. I mean, people from India and Gurkhas from Nepal, and then all the different British and some Free French and all that sort of thing. You felt it was really an international people going over to try to get rid of this.
Were people still living in the tubes at that time, or were they?
No, there were no tubes. It was all pretty well. There wasn't that much of a threat.
Okay.
I think 40, 41 was very bad.
Mm-hmm.
And because I remember we went to South America in 1940 on a ship, and we had a big American flag painted on the side plus on the top in case of an air attack. We went down to Rio and Buenos Aires and then flew across the Andes, which is very unusual then.
Right, yeah.
It was 20,000 feet, which is the highest air route in the world. And I can still remember that. And then we saw the German embassy in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. And of course, here's this big Nazi flag and all that sort of thing. But at any rate, and then we came up the other coast. But so I remember things like that. And I thought, well, the war is. I have friends that said we're going to, older people going to say we're going to be in this war. I think until I went in, and it finally closed in on me that I am actually. You just at that age you don't think that much about it. And things like that. But anyway, back so we spent Christmas in England, and of course everything was the blackout and all that sort of thing, and you had to kind of go knock on doors to get in. But there wasn't. We had much better food in camp than the British had. They must have decimated the rabbit population pretty much, and they always had fish and chips, of course, and so forth. But anyway, they took us down to Bournemouth or Plymouth or some, I've forgotten. And anyway, we got on a troop ship, and then we knew that we were going overseas. And of across the channel. That's what we did. And we landed at Le Havre, which had been rebuilt enough to get the ships and things in there, but had just been devastated. And then they put us on a train. Some of the people, I was looking at some of the material here, and some people took, they had to drive all the trucks and things too, but that was just the truck drivers with the guns and everything like that. But they put us in what they called 40 and 8, you might have heard of.
Which, well, could you explain to the...
Right,
to
from
Ken?
World War I. My dad would talk about it, 40 men or 8 mules or something there. But they were smaller boxcars is what they were. But it was very cold in France. That was one extremely cold winter.
Was it just a rough boxcar? I mean,
Yeah, just a box
and you
car.
just sat wherever, or they they put
Yeah, and you just, of course you got your jackets and your coats and heavy coats, but later on we didn't have those. But it was, of course it's very damp.
Yeah, I think when you said the
Yeah.
cold, I think wasn't it like the coldest winter Europe
Well,
had experienced in like 50 years?
I always said later, when that happened, and a little later, I said, well, whatever happens, I'm never going to go camping in the snow again, and I went mountain climbing. What Mother used to say, don't ever say you won't do something, because eventually you will.
Yeah.
But at any rate, I remember going across France in these 40 and 8s and things, and we stopped someplace in a little French town, I've forgotten, and I always remember it because Maybury, who was my sergeant, and he was the one that was older, 37 or 38, and my dad having died when I was so young, I needed a father figure, and I think he was, if you're 18 or 19 years old and somebody's 38, they're really getting up there, so. But anyway, we went into town, and some French woman was there, and she, I'd taken French in high school, in the boarding school, and I still remembered some, so she invited us in for a cup of coffee. And the coffee wasn't the best, but it was just to get in where it was warm. And I'll never forget that kindness, And she didn't have anything, really. And anyway, we got back on the train, and then we finally got to some place, forgotten exactly, some village or outside a larger, I think it was near Reims or Reims, where the cathedral is. And then they gave us, then they had their guns there for us, the mortars and all that stuff, so we knew it was serious. And they gave us the ammunition and things like that, and we stayed up most of the night getting everything. And some mail came in, and there was a letter from my headmaster, Mr. Squibb, and I remember he wrote something there and said, that things will never be quite the same again, your experiences you're going to have, and which is right, but at that moment. So anyway, we got in the jeeps the next morning, and of course you slept when you could and things, and we went through Belgium. Oh, good. Look at them. Anyway, we got our everything loaded, and we started out. And we went into Belgium, and a lot of these towns and villages were destroyed, and it was cold, and people were living in ruins and all that sort of thing. But still, V for victory. You'd see it, and you couldn't help but be touched, and everything. And then we went on, and we went into Luxembourg City, and then down to a place called Echternach. And I went there once, I went twice, a couple times after the war, and it was right on the Saar River, and right across is the Siegfried Line, the German defense line, their pillboxes and all this sort of thing. And we were lucky, we could put our weapons, our 81 millimeters out in the field, and this was a typical farmhouse, but there you'd open up the door and you went into the barn, which really is not a bad, we don't have that in our farms in America, but it was not a bad idea. But at any rate, we were there and just waiting to go on the offensive, but part of the Battle of the Bulge had been in that area, and still snow and very cold and everything, and we'd go down at night, and it was kind of interesting in a way, but it was such a weird thing to walk down the streets in Echternach, and it hadn't been blasted or anything, and there were still things in the shops, but the Germans had moved all the civilians out. And remember Maybury, this sergeant came back, he went patrol one night. He came back and he had on a pair of spats, which people used to wear down here, and a top hat and a cane. Well, like he was going out to dinner, you know. Oh yeah. Well, anyway, we went down there, and we had there was a post down there upstairs where you could, where they had some GIs there, and they blow out all the lights, and you could look right across the river there at the German fortifications, and then they put all the blinds and everything down. What they had was wine bottles with kerosene in it, and a rag rent, and talk about soot. But anyway, and so I went down 3 or 4 times, but it's so ghost-like, you know. And we'd see. Then Mabry and I went down when we were looking in this one house, and you know, all these people just had to leave. They left their clothes and pictures of their relatives and things like that. But at any rate, I remember one night and you also tie this in with certain songs and things. And I remember I came back and everybody was asleep. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was listening to the radio, and they said something about, there was a song by American composer, Don't Fence Me In. And I remember I was listening to that, and then I just went to sleep, and I woke up and my head was just on the desk, you know. And we began to get some dysentery and trench mouth. And see, that's back to World War I, trench mouth. And just simply because you don't get you're not clean. We went for 5 or 6 weeks without a bath.
Oh.
People have gone a lot longer, but so we all smelled about as bad as. So pretty soon you didn't notice the difference anyway. But we were there for maybe 10 days, and then one day, having taught geography, it's like our Chinook winds here, and they come over the Alps, and then as they come down, they heat up, and within 2 or 3 days, this 1.5 or 1.5 foot of snow, whatever it was, just disappeared for the most part, and it was probably 20, 30 degrees warmer.
A welcome relief. Huh?
Right, it really was. And then I remember somebody came in and said, I ought to see all those bodies out there. The Germans said they'd been just killed and they just left there, and they had the GIs, Germans had come up this hill from the Siegfried Line on the Luxembourg side of the river. And I remember this one young fellow, of course you're taught this, you know, the Germans are all Nazis and this and that. By that time in the war, they were taking anybody, you know, 15, 16-year-old kids and things like that. It wasn't like it had been. You know, after the Battle of the Bulge, that was kind of the final. They just really began to collapse.
Yeah.
As I said, that's one reason perhaps that saved my life by spending so much time. Because if I had gone over sooner, which many of my friends did, they saw combat in Italy. I think that'd been one of the worst places to work your way up that spine for a year or two. But at any rate, we went out and they looked, and I remember I reached and I kind of pulled him up, and of course rigor mortis had set in, but there was no destruction of tissue or anything. He was frozen as well. And so I took his wallet out and I just went through it, and there was a picture there. Wherever he was going overseas. He was not overseas, but he was going to war. And there he was, and he was up like this and had this nice kind of leaned against the doorway, and there was a nice German girl on his arm. Mm. And I remember I said to somebody, I said, well, thank God she didn't sing this way. And I put the wallet back and everything, so eventually with the papers he would be identified and found. He would hopefully find out what happened and things. But you know, you think about things like that, and sometimes it makes. I heard in World War II that some people like to collect Japanese skulls, and I remember there was one soldier there had an SS ring on it, which was supposed to be the real bad boys. But I don't know, he might have picked it up. I don't think he was an SS. But anyway, everybody, you know, that's a real souvenir. So one of the fellows went, and I might have done it myself. I'd have been a little earlier. He went back to the house and got a hatchet that was there cut the wood for the wood burning stove, and cut off the finger and took it as a souvenir. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's just, you know, weird. But at any rate, then they told us we were going to go down on the river and cross over. And kind of strange because when we were at Camp Mccoy, we trained with these boats, and they were, well, this is not a very good drawing, but I'll read a little bit of this too. I couldn't find the thing I wanted. But anyway, they were, and this was they were wooden boats, and it came up at an angle, but then the back was straight. Now, it probably would fit in here, except the doors would have to be a little wider and back, and it could take a squad of men, 6, 7 men. And we had trained with that, and I remember in launching and all, not that there's that much to it. And at any rate, we went down that one night, 2 or 3 nights later, and of course, once the Germans knew that we were coming across, well, they opened up whatever they had in their pillbox and everything like that, and it was, it's so strange in life. I mean, I've had like this auto accident. If I'd been sitting 6 inches to the right, I'd have been dead. That thing came through, and fortunately didn't hit anybody. It came between my wife and myself. But this is the same sort of thing. You know, once in a while these things happen. Once we were training in the barracks, and this fellow had a rifle or something, and he fired, and he didn't miss my head more than 3 inches. You know, just so people can die that way too, like this famous athlete that was shot overseas in the Middle East, in Iraq, some football player or something. I've forgotten who he was, and it was quite the news, and you know, these things just happen. But anyway, I remember we were dragging the boats down that street, and everything's a flash, and before that we'd gone by they said, well, you go ahead and put your mortar here, and it was an old cabbage patch is what it was, and had been. And so we get it all set up, you know, we think, boy, we can really bombard them. And then this 155, which is 25 millimeters, that's a 6-inch on a carriage, and they pulled in, and they really started lobbing some stuff over there and everything. Then they moved us out, and we joined. We're going to go on down and make the assault. And I remember the lieutenant, we were all just standing there, and he just happened to pick me, and I was a corporal, no big rank certainly, but instrument corporal to operate the gun and stuff like that, as far as the mortar goes like this. And so if somebody behind a hill, if it's an artillery, it would go over and miss him. But at any rate, I remember he said, and there's all this light and flash about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and he said, Corporal, you take these 3 or 4 men, and he showed us a house down the street there, and he said, you take these men down there, and you wait, we'll pick you up later. And and so I remember them going down that street, and I could hear, the flash and then the explosions and things, not right, but just around them, some distance, maybe a block or 2 away or something like that. And then the boats they'd hit on the cobblestone street, and they went around the corner, and almost every one of them was killed and drowned within an hour of that. Oh, of course, we didn't know that right then, so we went back and got in this house and went down the basement, and there was a stove down there, and let them shell. And we found some homemade jam, and one thing and another, and so we stayed there the night, and we got up, and the next morning, we got up at about noon or something. The lieutenant came back, and he said, let's go on down the river now. And so what had happened was that somewhere along the line, they got down there. We never knew the whole story, and their boats, well, first place, a mortarman, not the gunner. The gunner, all I would have, I wouldn't have a rifle. I would have had a 45, which, you don't want a lot of heavy weight, and the river was in flood stage. And normally it wouldn't be any wider from here to over there in the corner, maybe 20, 25 feet. But it was way up even over the trees. This is a little article, I'll just read a little bit
Okay,
of this.
sure.
But at any rate, they went down there, and some of the boats tipped over or whatever happened. And Mayberry, my sergeant, and all that were drowned or killed. And of course we didn't know that. The next morning we went and of course there's no bridge across or anything, but they did have some boats for us, and we went across, and there was a first aid man over there and was tending to a couple of people. And we went up the hill, and I said, oh, let's go in a defensive position here and either take one of these German foxholes, you probably heard about foxholes, and or dig your own. And so we were there probably maybe 4 or 5 days. There was some shelling, but not really that much. But I wanted to read a little bit. This fellow describes it. Now this is also the 417th Regiment, which I was in, but it was Company L. I was in Company B or C or something. But this is, and I think this is more or less describes what happened to these other people. I went overseas as a BAR, Browning Automatic Rifleman. That's a really rifle. 76th Division, 417th Infantry Regiment. For some reason, they don't have a lot of material on the 17th. Company L. Even a little bit I saw, I could appreciate this. Of all the actions in which we took part, two are indelibly etched in my memory. The first is our assault across the river, and he talks about being temporarily captured by the Germans. We had finished up in the Belgian truck to Echternach, Luxembourg, the city in the bank of the Saar River. The Siegfried Line starts across the river. We faced not only crossing the swift river at flood tide, but also ferocious defending by camouflaged pillboxes and fortresses. We met flat-bedded trucks about a mile west of the river. These trucks carried these wooden scow-like boats, and that's what I described to you. Was stacked on trucks and nestled into each other. Each squad carried its own clumsy, heavy boat to the edge of the river, and it was that. Then you got down on your knees, and see, and you'd be. But some of these ammo characters, they had a thing that slipped over for your head, and there was 3 ammo shells in the front and 3 in the back, which probably be 40 pounds. Oh hell, they got in there. They were down. And then they just went down in the river, and then the Germans had also put the concertina, which is barbed wire, and the fellas would get their leggings caught in that and held them down. See? So probably as many died from that as anything, but just a little bit. It's about a mile west of the river. By this time it was dusk. We could hardly see the river several hundred yards below us, but we could see the opposing German cliff, which loomed higher above. I suppose it's supposed to be a prize assault, but we started receiving artillery fire and so forth. Our company and I suppose other companies to either side started down, but couldn't get very far before the boats broke loose, banging into trees, and the guys running over boats, crushing into trees by boats, screams and star shells, flares, turning dusk into day. It was a scene out of Dante. Many were wounded. By this time I was officially assistant. By this time I was officially the assistant squad leader. And this is interesting. I never heard of this happening before, but I wouldn't doubt it. But since the squad leader had just shot himself, and then SIW is in their self-inflicted wound, so he just committed suicide. The boat was mine, and he goes on. We shoved off, and then he just goes on. But I just can't imagine what that would have been, and I just missed that because maybe I was standing in the right place. You just can't help but wonder. But anyway, then we went up on a hill a few days later, and I didn't find it it was in the original infantry thing, but we had one fellow with us. His name was Eisenhower, of all the names, but he was a crackerjack. He loved these machines, you know, and I'm not that way. But anyway, there was an 80 millimeter mortar, German mortar there. We had an 81, and he figured out that we could use that and fire and use the German shells and figure out the difference. So we did. And this little article, I couldn't seem to find it, but it was in the Division history, and it says it, and mentions our name, and the Germans, maybe they did, I don't remember all that, but at any rate, that the Germans buttoned up, and then they were able to they surrendered and so forth and stuff. And then they brought us down the hill. I remember we were coming down to be being relieved. Wasn't too sorry for that, although I really hadn't been on this in just a couple of weeks. And there was a one-star brigadier general coming up, I remember, and I was just tired. I even forgot to salute, and he just smiled at me in a fatherly way, and we went on down, and we went through town. By that time, the town was pretty secure, and the guys were driving. There was some motorcycle in one window. So this GI got it out, and he's driving up and down this motorcycle. Just some of the things that go on, it's just crazy, you know. But at any rate, then they said, we're going to take you back to Luxembourg City for a little relief. And in the meantime, I began to get this cough. And they brought in smoke machines to make smoke so the Germans couldn't tell where to shell along the river, and even on our side of the river. It wasn't completely secure because they had guns up higher on the hill, a couple of miles away, and a forward observer. That's what I was. What they could be up there and still, but that kind of blocked. They couldn't see where, you know. And I remember get this cough, and well, it persisted for 2 or 3 days, and we got a shower. Oh, that was wonderful. They had these tents set up and all these hot showers and stuff. And we went into town, but there wasn't anything really much there. And got a couple of beers or something. And this persisted, and so I remember I thought, well, I better go and just see if there's a problem here. And so the lieutenant was a doctor, and he gave me a couple of quick tests. He said, well, you've almost got pneumonia. It's not quite, but it's getting there. And he said, if I sent you back to the line, which is what they call it, he said, you'd just be back here in a week or less, or wherever. So that was my birthday, the 27th of February. He said, I'm putting you on a hospital train, and you'll be in Paris in the morning. Well, you know, you just hate things like that. Not really, of course, but so that was the finest birthday. That was my 20th birthday. Couldn't be a nicer birthday present than that. So I went back, and I was in Paris for 2 or 3 weeks, and you know, just recovering. And when you left your unit, originally they just, if they needed an instrument corporal and such, they just sent you there. But you know, your outfit and your friends are your home. Yeah. And guys would just take off. They're not really AWOL, but they go back to their units. So there was a lot more trouble for them. But they realized they got to return this fella back to his original unit. And that, I remember we got across the Rhine River, and they just broken through there recently. And they had a big boat made out of a lot of boats, you know, across, a carriage boat thing across, and it's like a road across. And then after, once the Americans got across the Rhine River, then you started running into the people trying to get away from the Russians. But at any rate, I got back to the outfit, and that part of the war was, I think, in contrast to the other, although I didn't see a lot of combat. You know, if you're going to be in a war, but be on the winning side. And by that time, there's no question in my mind we could have gone to Berlin. I remember a couple of German soldiers said who spoke some English and said, join us and we'll go fight the Russians. But everybody wanted to get away from the Russians, just obsessive thought, you know, just want to be. And there were people with their bicycles and from Lithuania and places like that, just anything to get away and just to mix. And as far as a place to go, I mean to stay, the first one they said, well, you can have one of these houses. So we picked this beautiful mansion with a ballroom and a marble floor and all. And we found it wasn't as comfortable as we thought it would be. So the next one was more of just an average home. And you know, we could heat some water with a fire and get a hot bath and stuff. And we're just simply standing around kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. And that's when I said about Berlin. I remember one night we just take the battery radios from the Germans. And that was, I remember some old lady was there. And somebody take it a radio, and she said, my radiola. You know, today I wouldn't do something like that. But I didn't take it, somebody else did. But anyway, and looking for eggs and things, and of course your friend would have an egg, and they go all over inside. You know, just clown stuff like that. But at any rate, so that few days, and then we kept moving around, and we didn't know exactly where we were, but I remember picking up that radio broadcast, and it was out of Berlin, and they're playing these Viennese waltzes, and it was in English. And so I thought when I'd been there in '38, Winter Day Linden, what's it like now? And it just must have been something you couldn't believe. And
Yeah.
I think some of the people went down, some of the German civilians, of course, they're just caught in all this, between two sides and everything. And they went down in the subway like the British did. And I think I read someplace that Hitler said, fled the subways to the river and went into the ground, and just all kinds of, there's been a couple of films made on it and so forth. Just, you just can't imagine all that sort of thing that was going on. But it was only 150 miles away. We could have gotten our Jeep and driven at least to the edge someplace. But we were held back, and that was part of the conference with the Russians, and I think they deserved it. By that time, Americans had met some Russian troops and so forth, and it was closing in, and then Mussolini, and everything began to collapse. Mussolini and his girlfriend were caught someplace, and they, I think it was Milan, they slit their throats and tied them up in a square, and they were there all day, and all of a sudden things, and then spring broke.
Now, were you getting this information? Did you know what was going on? Were you getting?
Well, yes, from some of the radio broadcasts, and a lot of things I just remember later. I remember it then, and also we would get a newspaper once in a while, Stars and Stripes, and then there'd just be rumors and things, and some were not true, and some were. But I remember somebody said Mussolini, and that had happened. It may have been several days before, and and we just waited around, and then finally. And we drove here and there, and I didn't, it's almost like you don't know where in the hell you're going. But I think they were trying to decide where the Americans were going to be and where the Russians were going to be and things like that. And so then they lined us up one morning, and this had been about 3 weeks after I got back from the hospital, 3 or 4 weeks in the hospital, and somebody read a directive from NATO. Not NATO, but the Allied Expeditionary Forces, and said all forward action will cease as of 2400 hours, May 7th or 8th, whatever it was, one of the two, and so forth. So we knew that, but the thing was, I didn't have enough. Probably some of the people you talked about the point system. And you got 5 points for being married, and you got 5 points for each child up through 2. I remember there was a cartoon in Yank magazine or something. This guy's got 4 or 5 kids, and then up to 2, and then he's just kicking the rest away. There was no points for it, which wouldn't really be true, but no. It's, but anyway, so there's 15 points, and then you got 5 points for or 10 points for every year in service, or every 3 months or something. And then you got something on combat, if you were in a combat zone, and so forth, a theater. And I was in the Rhine campaign and the Battle of the Bulge, although I didn't really see it, but I was in that area, see. And but I didn't have nearly enough points, and then they started lecturing us on China and things like that.
As far as being transferred over to the Pacific.
Well, that's the thing, you know, that you weren't going to go home. You're hoping perhaps you'd go through the States and have a short furlough. But then some of them were going down through the Panama Canal. And then they broke up our outfit, the 76 divisions, and they took the mortar men and put us in a bigger mortar outfit. It was, I think it's 101 meters or something, and it had a barreled, instead of a smooth bore. They always called us the plumbers, like they're not going around with a tube. And we trained with them. And by that time, well, of course, we just in the barracks, and we just requisitioned whatever. But I remember one night, I wasn't an experienced drinker then, and I some cognac. Of course, the officers got the shot or whatever, and then enlisted men would get some and things like that, and whatever we could find someplace and so forth. But anyway, we were with some cognac, and I didn't realize cognac was that strong. I was on guard duty that night. I sat around and drank some with some friends and talked about these things, and we were all staying in the houses around there and so forth. And then it was time to go on duty. And I'm just staggering up and down this street. But I didn't get caught. But So anyway, then I went down at about the atom bomb came, and I went down to the supply sergeant to get some, and they had this Radio Europe, Allied Radio Europe or something, and that's where we got some of our information too. And they were just announcing that they had dropped a nuclear weapon on Hiroshima. And then within the next day or two, of course, it was a few days, it was over. So we knew we were going to get home, but just when. But some people are already headed for the Pacific. My mother said that she had the feeling that if I went to Japan, I wouldn't have come home.
Yeah.
But I had friends who were there, and they got in right shortly after the bomb was dropped. One thing, and they said there were fortifications you wouldn't believe. And that's one of the things we've got with this situation in Iraq, you know. People willing to blow themselves up, what are you going to do?
Yeah, yeah.
It's not conventional warfare.
Yeah.
At least I knew who to shoot at. Yeah, it's just, and I think that at Saipan and Iwo Jima, and some of those, what's that new movie's come out about the forefathers, about the fighting on Iwo Jima?
Fathers of our flag.
Yeah, right. I saw it recently.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's just entirely different type, and people were jumping off cliffs rather than surrender, civilians.
Yeah.
And I think Truman and the whole group is looking, well, there's no way. It's an awful weapon, but we've developed, and if they won't, and we ask them, and they wouldn't surrender. And so then they dropped the second one very shortly after that. And
did you have any concept, could even grasp
No.
what this big thing was?
What's this thing? What in the world is this? And then we began to hear some things about it and so forth. And I thought, well, this thing may have saved my life, but on the other hand, what's going to happen in the future? Because they're going to refine these weapons, and within a year or two, I think the 3 Russians developed, well, don't have to go into all that, problem with Iran now. But I remember I thought at the time, well, this saved my life, perhaps. Well, what's going to happen in the future? And see the way. And I'm afraid that eventually man has never developed a weapon he didn't use. I just, but anyway, so I came home and...
How much longer then were you?
Well, I was there all that winter. And they sent him home according to the number of points. One of the highest point, which is only right, went home first. And I think I sailed out and I got home. We went back to Standish and a lot of German prisoners there serving us meals and things. And then we got on the train and went to Fort Logan. That was it, out here, out of Denver. And that's where I started, inducted. And so we were discharged there.
You remember when you first went home and saw your mom for the first time?
Well, my mother was gone. She was living down in Mexico City at the time. So I came home and she had written to me where some keys were, and I opened up the house, and she'd been down there all winter, and this was in March. And of course I knew people and everything, and so then in a few days I got a plane ticket, and I flew down to Fort Bliss in El Paso, where I'd been before, and stayed in a hotel room and went on down and joined her down there. And we spent a couple of weeks. We went down to Acapulco, which that was the resort at the time. There weren't many resorts, and nothing like it is now. And, but she lived down there during the war. And she had a boyfriend, and he was a calculator at the racetrack for computers. He'd be out of business now. And he'd figure, I know sometimes he'd figure a bridge score, I couldn't believe it, but he made $100 a day, which is a lot of money then. And after these results would come in, then he'd figure them out. And that was his job and everything. And he was a real comfort to my mother, because there was an English paper there in Mexico City for the tourists, and there were a number of people just living there then. And I remember he said, well, we'll look in the paper today to see what Generals Patton, I was in the Patton's Third Army, and Generals Hotchkiss and Patton are doing today, and things like that.
Did your mom ever talk to you about how she coped? I mean, particularly, your father being in World War II and what you'd seen it done to him, and now you over in harm's way. Did she ever talk about her feelings about how how it was for her during that time period?
No, she didn't. She's not very much. I've got a couple of letters here. These are the old V-mail.
Oh,
You
excellent.
remember those? Let's see, I'm trying to see. And there's, you're right about the war. This fight the government doesn't, let's see. Well, this was in March and I got back to my outfit. Well, I will soon be back with the outfit because I had to go through all kinds of different transfers around. I remember we were near the Maginot Line once when they were coming back and we went down in it. And of course that's passe now, but what fortifications they had. It is quite a job to get back through all the placement pools. And they finally get you down to your division and then to your company and so forth. I'm trying to think. Here's Luxembourg. I received your letter about 3 days ago. Hope you are receiving more of mine. We're pulled something back for a short rest period and let know when I expect to go. So I am something mail here. I'll read my own writing. Final letters. Letter from you lately. That's March. But no, she never said a lot about that. And but I think I said the only thing she ever said was she said, "I just have this woman's intuition after the war was over that you went to Japan, you wouldn't come home." And she might have been right.
Yeah, right.
But I think it would have cost us. Truman's been criticized for it, but it'd been a lot we'd have sacrificed. You know, that would have been a terrible mistake. We had it, and we had to do it, and then they finally. But
what was that? They figured up to 1 million Americans would have been killed in the
yeah,
invasion.
they estimate. And this friend of mine was over there to say, he said they had fortifications and things you couldn't believe, and they would have fought to the death. And but. Anyway, there's one here. Let's see, there's a little description of. Here's some pictures of the. Just look at these yourself. This is after the war. Then we were able to do a little sightseeing around, and this is the crow's nest. You probably heard about. And you'll see the town down below. And then this is the SS nursery there, where the Germans made nice German babies, you know. Well, I heard about that. There was an article in the paper recently about it, as a matter of fact. And those people are, you know, just, of course their children are your age or older and so forth, and some of the women are still around. And there's another that was bombed. And then this is driving up the hill. And then you got, I don't have a picture of it, I never took many pictures, this is from somebody else that gave me these. And then the cars that parked down here, and then they had these huge brass doors. And hell, there was an elevator in there, almost as big as this room. And when I was there, they said, field grade officers only, which means lieutenant colonel or higher. Eisenhower came and says, take it down. But that was before, and then so the others I'd just walk up. But it was quite interesting to see. Now all that's been destroyed.
Yeah.
And I don't know, historically speaking, I think that was a mistake. And there's the swimming pool at the, and there's one of the German homes we stayed in and stuff like that. There's a fraternizing Fräulein.
Uh-oh.
Oh.
How was it, the interaction then with the German civilians and such?
Well, nothing like we're getting into right. Well, it was a similar culture, and I think looking at the way we handled Germany and Japan, we just made so many mistakes in Iraq. I could talk about it for a week and I wouldn't, but you know, and of course, entirely different culture. And I look at all that, and maybe it could have been done. I don't know. At the time, I kind of felt, well, this is good. But Baker said in his commission, he said, nobody asked me. And at the time, his question, well, they're winning the war. Why don't they go on to Baghdad? Well, you saw what happened. But I think we handled that well with the Germans, and we just simply took some, not people in concentration camps and guards and things like that, but a lot of people were brought back to to function. And that's what we didn't do in Iraq. And we don't even have the power they had under Hussein. And I think Japan, as MacArthur did a wonderful. I've been in Japan once. I went over there with the Colorado Mountain Club. It was the first American mountain club to visit Japan. That was 30, 35 years ago, and it's just entirely different. And I say I couldn't help but contrast some of that with what we've done now and so forth. But this isn't an open-ended situation over there now. But anyway, we did a very good job, and I think Germans in general. Well, I know that first Christmas after the war, we were in a kind of a dormitory type thing there, and the Germans would go, we'd take our garbage and dump it, and then they'd come and get it, you know. And a lot of GIs were sleeping with German girls, and you know, you could get sex for a package of cigarettes. And that's a strange thing. Cigarettes became the barter. And so I was smoking at the time, and I quit. And I think you're allowed one or two or three cartons of 10 packs each that you could buy, and they were shipped in from the States. So we had this fella came over from the Russian area, a Russian occupied area, had a big barracks bag, and he'd give us $50 or $100, something like that, for that. And so I think I saved $1,000 or something and quit smoking for a while. I won a little bit in some poker games too. But I think in general that we just we seem to get along. Never know. But I think some of the younger men, you'd see so many men without legs and arms and things like that had come back. And I thought, God, if you're defeated, and then you come back and your city's destroyed. But I was there a year ago this last summer and took one of those cruises, you know. We stopped in Erlangen and some of these places where I'd been, these pictures were taken, and of course they've rebuilt everything now.
Yeah, could you contrast
Right.
your trip from '38 to your experience to your post-war visits? What you'd seen?
Yeah, and all those things. I remember Nuremberg was just absolute, and all those walls have been rebuilt and everything, and they don't horse around if you make any particular. I don't know about an American, but locals can get in some problems by making any probe, but there wouldn't be any. But they were, and they took us out and showed us where they. I remember seeing it during the war, or after the war, where they shot the famous picture, and the swastikas up on the top, and there's a picture of the pool in that same area, and some of those things have been preserved, and but there's still some neo-Nazis around. That's.
Yeah.
But
Do you remember when you were, as you guys were marching through on your way to Germany, going through any places that you had visited on your trip in '38 and saying, "Wow, I remember what"?
No, not. We were in Belgium, I believe, but see, I was still pretty young. I was only 13,
Okay.
and I know we were in Holland. And no, there's no place. I think if I'd have got to Berlin, I would have recognized some things there at least. In fact, I've still got the door thing that said, "Please do not disturb," and it's upstairs.
Huh.
And I just took that as a souvenir, you know. But it was, I could see that there was a great difference. And of course, then I went this time and everything's. But I went in I went in 56, 10 years after war, and I still were planes that really fly over there. And I took a boat and I spent 8 months just bumming around Europe. And went to places I hadn't been, like Spain and Portugal. Got all the way to the Turkish border in Iraq, and turned around, came back, and I didn't have some papers, but I went for 8 months. Of course, that's the time the dollar commanded respect, and I think I spent $700 or $800. Of course, I wasn't staying in the best hotels, and stayed in youth hostels and things and whatever. But that was a wonderful experience. And when I went to Turkey this fall, late summer, early fall. Of course, these cities have just grown. It's just very hard to recognize, except some of the monuments and things. But anyway, so I've traveled a lot. I think that's because I had done it at home when I was a kid. Those 2 trips in that South America and to Europe, and of course at that time people just weren't doing those things.
Right.
They didn't have the time. That's the reason teachers would do it.
Yeah.
Because you had to go for at least a month or 6 weeks. I say, took you a week to get over there and a week to come back. But there wasn't none of this mass tourism, and I think that bothers me because I remember, and we weren't wealthy, but Dad for that time in a depression and all made pretty good money, and we had our own cars. I think there were 8 or 9 of us total, and the car would come to the hotel, and there would be 2 cars, and they'd take us and things, and then we'd go on to the next or whatever. And same way with South America and the ships, but that flight over the Andes was. And then I went back years later and climbed the peak. But I remember it was just little tubes, you know. I think there were 12 or 14 of us in the plane, and we got in the center there or something, and the plane was coming from Santiago, so it was kind of a little there for a minute, and then the steward, there were men, and he's looking out the window. He said, "Aconcagua, Aconcagua." Whenever I looked out the window, that's the south face, what I wouldn't try to do, which you go up the other way. It's a walk up, although a lot of people die up there because it's almost 23,000. And here, 30 years later, I went back and climbed it.
Wow.
Yeah, so anyway. But,
Well, let me ask a few questions, and then we'll
Sure.
start to wind down the
Sure,
interview a
fine.
little bit. But what was it? Can you describe what conditions were like? You said you went long periods of time without showers, sleeping conditions, food. What was it like as an infantryman? Did you get enough sleep? What was the food like?
well,
What was
the
it?
little bit I had, I was better off not being in a rifle company. Because they're, as I said previously, they were the first ones, and nobody in front of them except the enemies. Oh, I think when you're young and things, you know, you can do it. And everybody kept a sense of humor, and that's what you had to do. But from time to time, there would be these things like when Mayberry, and I knew he drowned down there. And it's funny now, because he'd be in a chow line in England, they put us in some old English manor houses and things. And there was that song, and you always hear it this time, "I'll be home for Christmas, only in my dreams." And so somebody say, "Mayberry, gotta be home for you." "Oh, I'll be home, don't you worry." And of course, he didn't. And he drowned in that boat and everything. And it was hard. But I was young. I couldn't do that now.
Yeah.
That's the reason they want them young.
Yeah.
But, you know, you get dysentery and this and that. And finally, you kind of, I guess you get used to it. But I had friends who were over there for 2 or 3 years and that sort of thing. I just had a matter of a month or 2. And I was very lucky, fortunate enough just to see that I didn't want any more of it.
What goes through a person's mind when you're getting ready to go into battle? What do you? I mean, the uncertainty of what's over that hill or what's going to happen. How did you prepare yourself for something like that? Do you remember?
Well, as far as an actual charge or anything, I never did any of that because the infantry are up ahead of us. That thing I read to you, see, there's the ones that really, and as with this lieutenant telling me to take these men back, they went on down, and I would have had that experience if I'd have survived it. I think.
But you were heading into that experience.
Yeah, right.
What?
And if we'd gone on down, well, he said, "Well, you take these men back," and I was somewhat relieved. And but you don't know, maybe the next day, and then by that time,
that unknown
area had been cleared.
Does that unknown play on you though, on your mind?
Well, I know sometimes in the mortars and things, the Germans would fire, and sometimes they used to go plop. The firing pin or something didn't go. But you'd hear them coming in and just get down the foxhole, and I don't. Yeah, it's. But I think in this was a combat situation, but not really like you see in the movies, and some of these things are exaggerated too. But and there's an awful lot of times you're just simply waiting around for something to happen or whatever. And
And how did you deal when you heard that Mayberry and a bunch of your friends had died? How do you?
Well, I thought about it, and then it's only after I got home and I got thinking about it. And as I got older, I thought, you know, well, I used to tell everybody now, remember, you go to London and whatever little souvenirs or whatever you may bring back or somebody's phone number, all that stuff, if you're killed, that goes home. And yeah, but Mayberry was stepping out with some gal and all this stuff, and you know, they were there. Of course, they were more experienced with women. Here we're 18, 19 years old, you know. And this was, you know, but that's just human nature.
Yeah, yeah.
And I hope nothing was sent home. I don't think, you know, but there was a lot of things like that, and the sex and everything, and you know. But the French couldn't understand when the Americans came in to Paris, they didn't take over the houses of prostitution. And the officers get, you know, rank always pays, but they just couldn't believe it. And you know, we still see a lot of that. And, some of our presidents, I'm not saying some of these things happen in the White House is the best thing. If you're going to worry about something really important.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you remember? What you were feeling when you heard both about the German surrender and then VJ Day? The thought, oh, you know, I made it through it, through this. And
yeah, I don't know. I was glad. I think the thing is, you're thinking, well, I just want to get home right now. You know, and I think the thought comes into your mind and everything. Why was it me? And you read a lot of literature on this, and why was I spared? I was standing at a certain place.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
And I know in Normandy, the officers were into the French farmer. Well, we were in this barn upstairs, and you had to go up on a ladder, and then there's this opening. Here's all this hay in there, and the cows are down below, and we're smoking. That was more dangerous. Oh,
Yeah.
we just never thought about those things.
Wow.
But I look back and my God, there's probably more danger there than I was in anything else. So one cigarette. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's.
How was the adjustment once you got back home?
Oh,
Going from military life back to civilian life and being out of a war situation.
We used to meet with friends the first couple of year or two, you know, and talk about the war, and then gradually it recedes in your conscience and so forth. And you don't. Then years later, you come back and look at it. And a friend of mine said that he was in a campaign from just died recently, but he was in a campaign. He started in North Africa, went all the way through Italy, and I think that was one of the. We always hear about D-Day and everything, but that Italian campaign, we're the first army to ever go up. Some of these people, Hannibal, have come down and so forth, but not up. And psychologically, in a lot of other ways. And then he was wounded in the invasion of southern France, which wasn't anything like D-Day, and they sent him home. But you know, he was over there for 2.5 years.
Mm.
So.
Well, how do you think the war affected your life, or what role did it play in your life? Do you think?
Well, going back to this fellow, he said once. I said, well, Larry, you've seen a lot more combat than I ever did, and everything. What do you feel about the whole thing you're experiencing? 2.5 years overseas and all this sort of thing. And he said, because he went in a year or two before I did, a couple of years older than I was. And he says, well, I wouldn't give $1 million for it, but I would give 2 cents to have it again. And no, I look on it, but then I think too, with some sadness, you know, the United Nations and all this sort of thing, and just like the League of Nations, and we're right. See, look at the wars we've had since then.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I'm afraid we might even destroy ourselves, or come close to it. Yeah. And so many innocent people. That's the thing. And so I think there's certain lines that just go along, and and everybody reacts a little different. Like that fellow that committed suicide, and you know, Everybody has their breaking point.
Yeah, yeah.
But I'm glad I had the experience. But I do regret not having those years, 18, 19, you know,
Right.
and see, I went in 4 months after I was 18 or 18 years old. So I missed those years when you went back to school and everything was different, you know. You can't, and I'm sorry I lost that.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I got some other things that were good too. But it would have been nice, like I see these kids up on campus and stuff, see. And by the time I came back, 21, 22, different experiences and everything, it's, you know, you look at things differently than they. So.
Well, as we close down the interview, was there anything that I didn't ask you, or anything you wanted to say, or any closing comments you'd like to make before we?
No, only as I said earlier that look at the wars we've had since my father was in World War I was in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Gulf War I, now the second. And I don't know, I think it's very sad. But I think for some reason it's just the way mankind is. And I remember reading once in Churchill or somebody said, well, certain men make a decision that may send thousands to their death. And that never changes, does it? A mistake, maybe not a mistake. And so that's, but I looked at it a little differently because of my travels and things. But as I said, I wouldn't give anything for it, but I wouldn't want to have it again. And I've never kept in touch with anyone much. A couple of people, and I think one died here because I sent him in the car. He was on a troop ship coming home with me. German instructor in a high school or something. And so, and I think if you talk to soldiers from other countries, they would say the same thing, and you know, you have experiences and things that you wouldn't give anything for. But and I think there's a certain bond there between, you know, because we went by the tomb of the unknown soldier in the Champs-Élysées there. You always salute.
Yeah.
Well, I know when I was traveling in Russia some years ago, I went into this room where they had St. Petersburg was under terrible siege with the Germans and everything. They just had the names of some of these soldiers that were killed, and I think Russia made such a sacrifice. And I remember I just saluted and walked out the door.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank you for your participation in this project, and more importantly, I want to thank you for your service to our country.
Well, thank you.